Okay, today we are embarking on a really deep dive into someone who I think remains one of the most chilling um, paradoxes of our time. Theodore John Kaczynski, who most people know as the Unabomber.
It's a journey we almost have to take, especially right now. Kaczynski's own story just reached its conclusion with his death, and that puts a sort of grim final punctuation mark on a criminal campaign that went on for, what, 17 years?
Yeah, 17 years.
Yeah.
And it completely reshaped things like forensic science and how federal law enforcement even approaches these kinds of cases.
Exactly. We're talking about a genuinely brilliant mind here. I mean, a real mathematical prodigy, but someone who then orchestrated this sustained, brutal campaign of terror. And it was all fueled by this incredibly articulate yet, well, profoundly misanthropic ideology.
So our mission today is really to unpack all that complexity. We're going to trace that terrifying path from, a Harvard academic to a domestic terrorist. We'll look at the Manhunt, which was just unprecedented in scale.
And the forensic breakthrough. That's a key part, how they finally cracked the case.
Right. And then we also need to touch on that lingering question mark that sort of followed him right up until the end. That possible connection, though it's never been proven, to the infamous Chicago Tylenol murders.
And the news, like you said, it's pretty definitive. Kaczynski died June 10th, 2023. He was 81, and sources confirmed it was suicide.
Yeah, apparently found hanging himself. They said he used shoelaces attached to a handicap rail in his cell. He was in a federal prison medical center in Butner, North Carolina at the time.
He'd been serving, 8 consecutive life sentences with absolutely no possibility of parole.
That's right. And sources mentioned he'd been moved to that medical facility back in, I think, December 2021. Apparently, he had late-stage rectal cancer. And reports said he was severely depressed and quite frail just before his death.
It's really the final chapter. I mean, this is a man who killed 3 people directly, injured 23 others. But what makes this whole story so compelling and frankly disturbing is that contrast, isn't it?
Totally. How does someone with that level of intellect, who spends his life railing against what he called the dehumanizing force of the industrial technological system,
how does he then turn around and use meticulous homemade technology bombs to express that rejection?
and then get caught? Not because of, bomb fragments or ballistics.
No, but because of grammar, because of the way he wrote. It's extraordinary.
So let's try and unpack that trajectory for everyone listening. We need to go from the lecture halls of places like Harvard and Berkeley out to that remote cabin in Montana, and really try to understand how that intellect warped into such relentless, focused rage.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Chicago. Theodore Kaczynski was born there May 22nd, 1942. He was the older of 2 boys, second-generation Polish-American family. And right from the get-go, the defining thing about him was his intelligence, just exceptional, almost overwhelming brain power.
And we're not just talking, smarter than average. This was genuine prodigy territory. Sources confirm his IQ was tested at a huge 167. He could just absorb advanced concepts, especially in math and theoretical physics, incredibly quickly.
But that same intelligence, that gift, it was also the source of his first really deep, isolating experience. There was this pivotal moment, probably crushed his self-esteem a bit, when he skipped the 6th grade entirely.
Ah, right. So academically it makes sense, but socially.
Socially, it was a disaster for him. Suddenly, he's totally out of sync with his peers. He's physically smaller, maybe emotionally less mature, and he's thrown in with kids who are much older, much bigger.
And the sources suggest he wasn't always withdrawn, right? Before that, he was actually kind of outgoing.
Yeah, apparently he was even a bit of a leader among kids his own age. But after skipping that grade in that new, older environment, he just became profoundly isolated. He was bullied. He didn't form those necessary bonds with kids his age.
So he retreated inwards.
Completely. Became solitary and developed this deep, lasting feeling that he just didn't fit in. And that pattern, that brilliant isolation, it basically carried him right through high school.
But academically, he was still flying. Graduated high school at just 15, and then entered Harvard on a scholarship at 16 years old in 1958.
Yeah, 1958. Just think about that. He's barely more than a kid, walking into one of the most intense academic environments on the planet. Apparently, he initially lived at 8 Prescott Street, which was sort of housing for some of Harvard's youngest, most brilliant incoming students.
And he excelled there
Right.
as a math prodigy. Got his BA from Harvard in 1962.
He did. But Harvard wasn't just academics for him. There was also that experience with the psychological experiments. That might have played a role, too.
Right, the experiments run by Dr. Henry Murray, Those sound pretty intense.
They were controversial, to say the least, involved these really aggressive, verbally abusive interrogations. The idea was to simulate extreme stress, basically humiliate the participants, break down their egos, all under the guise of studying stress responses.
That sounds awful, especially for someone already struggling.
Kaczynski himself later called it humiliating, deeply disturbing. You have to imagine, for a young man already dealing with isolation and probably trust issues, it certainly didn't help.
Okay, so after Harvard, he keeps climbing that academic ladder. University of Michigan for his master's and PhD in math.
And his PhD thesis on complex analysis was apparently so advanced that only a couple of people in the whole department could even really understand it.
That just shows the level he was operating at.
Absolutely. So he finishes his PhD, and the logical next step is academic stardom. In 1967, he becomes the youngest assistant professor of mathematics at UC Berkeley. A huge deal.
But he didn't last long there at all, did he? Barely 2 years. What happened? Was it the teaching, the research?
It seems like it was more a clash of personality and the whole environment. He resigned really abruptly in 1969. You have to remember Berkeley in the late 60s. It was the epicenter of, political upheaval, social change, protests.
Very politically charged, very socially liberal.
Exactly. And for Kaczynski, who was intensely introverted and becoming increasingly rigid in his thinking, that whole atmosphere was just repellent. He couldn't adapt.
So it wasn't a lack of talent. It was the human element again, the social, the political stuff he couldn't handle.
Precisely. And that resignation, it basically slammed the door shut on his entire professional life. He walked away from this incredibly promising academic career to do something completely different. Total isolation.
After a brief, probably uncomfortable stint back, living with his parents.
He makes the move that defines the rest of his life, the move to Montana.
The famous 10 by 14-foot cabin, plywood and tar paper.
Yep, in 1971, he bought this small 1.4-acre plot of land outside Lincoln, Montana. And this wasn't like a weekend getaway cabin. This was a deliberate ideological choice. He set out to live this primitive, totally self-sufficient life, no electricity, no running water, no heating beyond a wood stove.
But that self-sufficiency label needs a bit of an asterisk, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He wasn't entirely cut off from the system he claimed to despise.
No, not at all. That's one of the big ironies. He did take some odd jobs here and there, but sources are clear. He relied pretty heavily on financial support that his family, mainly his mother and his brother David, sent him regularly.
So even in isolation, he's still connected to and dependent on the very society he's rejecting.
Exactly. But that isolation was the perfect breeding ground for, well, you could call it intellectual self-radicalization.
And his reading habits shifted dramatically out there, Red.
Oh, completely. He went deep into political philosophy, sociology, but the absolute key influence, the one book that changed everything for him, was Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society. It's a French philosophical work from 1954.
What's the core idea of Ellul's book?
Ellul argues that technology, or what he called technique, has become this autonomous, almost totalitarian force. It governs every single aspect of human life now, and it makes genuine freedom basically impossible.
So Ellul gave him the intellectual framework, the theory that turned his personal anger and resentment into a kind of global critique.
Yes. His brother David later called that book Ted's Bible. When Ted read it, he apparently wrote about feeling this absolute delight, saying Ellul expressed exactly what he'd already been thinking. It formalized his anti-technology stance. Now, his hatred of things like noisy snowmobiles or logging trucks or new roads cutting into the wilderness near his cabin, it had a philosophical justification for violence.
But the sources, especially his journals, they suggest that beneath all the complex philosophy, the real driver was something much more raw. Just pure rage.
His journals are brutally honest about that. There's an entry, April 6, 1971, where he flat out wrote that he acted merely from a desire for revenge. He said he wasn't interested in revolution for, altruistic reasons or the good of humanity. He was just furious about development encroaching on the wilderness he loved near his cabin.
And that rage started to manifest physically, didn't it? Yeah. First with smaller acts of sabotage locally.
Yeah, starting around 1975. Little things at first. Messing with construction equipment, maybe some minor arson, setting booby traps for people involved in local development projects. It was a slow burn, an escalation.
And the sources also reveal some really disturbing things about how dangerous he was becoming, even to people who knew him or thought they knew him.
Definitely. There are chilling stories. Neighbors later recalled suspecting him of poisoning their dog, Wiley. But the most terrifying stuff came out of his journals later, fantasies he had, and some incredibly close calls.
Close calls involving his own family members.
Exactly. The journals detailed times when he'd apparently pointed a loaded gun at his own stepmother and at his sister, completely without their knowledge. He was just spiraling down into this world of intense hatred and plotting.
It really underscores that while his family was sending him money, supporting his isolation, they had no idea they were potentially in mortal danger from him.
No idea at all. One neighbor who lived near him apparently expressed this profound sense of relief after the arrest, saying Kaczynski's writings about his victims, calling them experiments, were just terrifying. It highlights how cold-blooded and indiscriminate the attacks were about to become.
So that dissent, that festering rage, it finally explodes into this 17-year campaign of anonymous violence, starting in 1978. And it baffled investigators for nearly 2 whole decades.
It was such a long, difficult case that the FBI literally had to come up with a code name just based on their internal filing system. That's where Unabomber came from.
Right, university and airline bomber, reflecting those early targets.
Exactly. Academic institutions, commercial airlines, that was his initial focus.
And the law enforcement response, the task force, it just grew and grew over time, didn't it?
Oh, massively. The sheer time and money spent are almost unbelievable. The Unabomber task force eventually had over 150 full-time investigators working on it. People from the FBI, sure, but also the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, because so many of his devices were sent through the mail.
And it ran for how long?
Well, it was formally established in 1979 after that airline bombing attempt, and it ran right up until his arrest in 1996. It became one of the longest, most expensive investigations in FBI history.
Let's talk about the bombs themselves, because these weren't just, crude pipe bombs thrown together. Kaczynski's background, his meticulous nature, his mathematical mind, it really showed in how he built these things. That's why they were so hard to trace back to him.
You absolutely nailed it. He wasn't just buying parts off the shelf. In many cases, he was making the components himself. That's why he gave that internal nickname sometimes, the junkyard bomber. He used common stuff, bits of wood, metal pipes, basic chemicals, but he put them together with this extraordinary precision.
What were some of those specific features, the things that made his bombs so unique and so hard for forensics to pin down?
Well, he was almost pathologically careful about hiding clues. The bombs themselves were often put inside these very carefully handcrafted wooden boxes, and he would sand them down over and over again.
Why? To get rid of fingerprints.
Fingerprints, yes, but also any microscopic tool marks that could potentially be matched back to, say, a specific brand of power saw he might have used. He also often made his own screws.
Wait, he made his own screws? From scratch?
Yeah, apparently fashioning them out of little scraps of metal, instead of just using standard store-bought screws.
Why go to that level of effort?
Because even a seemingly generic screw might have tiny metallurgical differences or manufacturing marks that forensic analysis could potentially trace back to a specific factory batch or maybe even a region where they were sold. Kaczynski wanted total anonymity, complete operational security.
Anything else?
Oh, yeah. He peeled the labels off batteries he used for the timers, just to remove any brand names or serial numbers before putting them inside the device. He was applying his PhD-level intellect purely to making untraceable weapons.
But despite all that effort to stay anonymous, he did eventually add a kind of signature, didn't he, later on?
He did. Starting in the late 80s, some of his bombs had the initials FC etched or stamped onto metal parts inside. It stood for Freedom Club, and he deliberately put this marking on parts that were likely to survive the explosion.
So that wasn't about helping the investigation. It was about claiming responsibility ideologically.
Precisely. Making sure his message, his Freedom Club, was found in the wreckage. It was about leaving his mark, not clues to his identity.
Okay, let's walk through the timeline of the attacks. It started relatively small, near Northwestern University in May 1978.
That's right. The first bomb was actually found in a parking lot. It was addressed to a professor, Buckley Crest. A university police officer, Terry Marker, opened it and got minor injuries. Then, almost exactly a year later, May 1979, another bomb at Northwestern injured a graduate student named John Harris. These first couple were, well, they were dangerous, but maybe more intended to injure and scare than to kill.
But things escalated significantly in November 1979. The airlines, that's how we got the A in Unabomber.
Yeah, that was the altitude-triggered bomb on American Airlines Flight 444. It was flying from Chicago to D.C. The device went off mid-flight in the cargo hold. Now, thankfully, it didn't blow a hole in the plane or cause a crash, but it filled the cabin with thick smoke. 12 people ended up needing treatment for smoke inhalation.
And that's when the FBI really got involved in a big way.
Absolutely. Targeting random passengers on a commercial flight, that was a huge escalation. It signaled a terrifying new level of threat and brought the full weight of the federal government into the hunt.
And his targets continued to be linked to technology, universities, corporations.
Definitely. In 1980, he mailed a bomb to Percy Wood, who was the president of United Airlines at the time. Wood suffered pretty severe cuts and burns. Then, in 1982, he targeted university staff again. A secretary at Vanderbilt, Janet Smith, got terrible hand injuries from shrapnel, and an engineering professor back at his old stomping grounds, Berkeley Diogenes Angelakos, was injured too.
The year 1985 seems like a real turning point, though. A shift towards much more devastating and ultimately fatal attacks.
It was. In May 1985, John Hauser. He was a graduate student at Berkeley, also an Air Force captain with dreams of being an astronaut. A bomb blast just destroyed his career and changed his life forever. He lost 4 fingers, lost vision in one eye, just horrific.
And then just a few months later, the first death.
December 1985. Hugh Scruton, who owned a computer rental store in Sacramento, California, he was killed opening a package left outside his store. That was it. Kaczynski had crossed the line from injuring academics and executives to deliberately murdering people who represented the technology sector he hated.
And it was 2 years after that first murder in 1987 that investigators finally got their first real tangible lead, right? A description.
Yes. February 1987, there was a bombing outside a computer store in Salt Lake City, and this time a witness saw someone placing the device. She gave police a description, which led to that famous composite sketch.
The guy in the aviator sunglasses and the hooded sweatshirt.
That's the one. It was plastered everywhere. And it absolutely terrified Kaczynski. He saw it, recognized himself, and instantly realized how close he might be to getting caught. So he just stopped. He went completely silent, halted the bombing campaign for 6 full years. That one sketch bought the public a long but temporary reprieve.
But when he came back in 1993, he came back with a vengeance. The attacks were sophisticated, aimed at really specific fields.
Ferocious is the right word. June 1993, he mailed a bomb that severely injured Charles Epstein, a prominent geneticist at the University of California, San Francisco. Epstein lost several fingers. Just 2 days later, another bomb targeted David Gelernter, a well-known computer science professor at Yale.
Kaczynski's injuries were devastating too.
Horrific. Lost sight in one eye, hearing in one ear, badly damaged his right hand. Kaczynski was clearly targeting leading figures in fields he saw as driving the technological nightmare.
And then the final 2 attacks were both fatal, occurring just before he made his big move with the Manifesto.
Right. December 1994, Thomas J. Mosser, an advertising executive, was killed by a mail bomb sent to his home in New Jersey. Kaczynski later wrote, chillingly, that he targeted Mosser because his PR firm, Burson Marsteller, had helped Exxon clean up its public image after the Exxon Valdez oil spill disaster.
Wow. So specific retribution in his mind.
Exactly. And then the final victim, April 1995, Gilbert Brent Murray. He was the president of the California Forestry Association, a timber industry lobbyist group, killed by a mail bomb disguised as a package addressed to the previous president of the association.
When you look at that list of targets, geneticists, computer scientists, airline presidents, ad executives, timber lobbyists, it's like he was attacking the symbols of the system he hated. But the victims were just people doing their jobs.
That's the absolute core of his pathology, I think, the dehumanization. He didn't see them as individuals, as fathers or husbands or colleagues. He saw them as interchangeable parts in the machine he wanted to destroy. His own inability to connect with people on a human level allowed him to view them as just necessary casualties, experimental components, as he horrifyingly called them, in his one-man revolution. So after 17 years of the FBI chasing shadows, the Unabomber himself basically forced the endgame. He decided he needed the world to read his ideas, all 35,000 words of them.
This was the infamous Manifesto, Industrial Society, and its Future. And he didn't just release it. He issued an ultimatum in 1995, right? Publish the whole thing or the bombings continue.
Exactly. He sent copies to major newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and it put the Attorney General, Janet Reno, and the FBI Director, Louis Freeh, in this absolutely terrible position.
Yeah, what do? Do you give a terrorist a massive public platform? Do you negotiate? Or do you risk more lives?
It was an unprecedented ethical nightmare for the government, but ultimately they decided with heavy hearts, I imagine, to recommend publication. The main reason was public safety. They hoped desperately that someone, somewhere, maybe a former professor, an old classmate, a family member, would read it and recognize the unique voice, the specific ideas, and finally give the FBI the lead they needed.
And so, the Washington Post, with financial help and agreement from the New York Times, published the entire manifesto as a special supplement in September 1995. This huge document meant to be his lasting ideological statement.
It became the very thing that brought him down, almost immediately.
But before we get to the capture, let's spend a minute on the ideas in that manifesto, because, okay, it fueled horrific violence, but the critique itself, Kaczynski's argument, it had a kind of coherent philosophical core, didn't it? Even if it was filtered through paranoia.
It absolutely did. You have to grapple with the ideas to understand the man, and why some people, even today, find them compelling.
Okay, so what was the main thesis? That opening line is pretty stark.
The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. That's how it starts. His argument, boiled down, is that the system, this highly organized, technological, bureaucratic society we live in, it's become self-perpetuating. It runs itself. And to keep running efficiently, it has to control human behavior in increasingly rigid ways.
So the system isn't designed for human happiness or freedom.
Not according to Kaczynski. It's designed purely for its own efficiency and growth. Human needs, real freedom, autonomy, those are secondary or even obstacles to the system's logic.
And he had that concept to explain why people in modern society often feel, unfulfilled or anxious, even when they have material comfort.
Right, the idea of surrogate activities. Kaczynski argued that humans have this deep, innate psychological need for what he called the power process. That's the cycle of having a goal, putting in effort, achieving that goal, and experiencing autonomy or power over your situation. Think about primitive humans hunting or farming for survival.
Okay, so that's the real power process.
Yes. But Kaczynski says the technological system basically takes care of all our basic survival needs with minimal effort required from us. So it strips away the opportunity for that genuine power process. We don't have to struggle for survival in the same way.
So we're left with a void. And we fill it with fake goals.
That's his argument. Surrogate activities are all the things we pour our energy into that aren't essential for survival just to satisfy that craving for the power process. He lists things like intense scientific research, dedicating your life to political activism, obsessively following sports teams, even complex hobbies.
He saw all of that as basically pointless.
Yeah, essentially pointless distractions, intellectual busy work, things that make us feel like we're striving and achieving, but which ultimately just keep us docile and integrated into the very system he believed was destroying true human freedom.
That is a profoundly dark view, suggesting that almost everything modern people value, science, art, social causes, is just empty.
It's incredibly cynical, and that's why some serious thinkers, like the political scientist James Q. Wilson, actually took his writings seriously, philosophically speaking. Wilson famously asked, if Kaczynski's ideas make him mad, then what about Rousseau? Or Marx? Weren't their critiques of society also radical, also calling for massive upheaval?
So Kaczynski saw revolution as the only answer. Reform was impossible.
Absolutely. He believed the system was too entrenched, too self-regulating. You couldn't tweak it, you had to destroy it entirely and return to a more primitive way of life.
And this dense, specific, often academic-sounding manifesto, filled with these unique arguments, this was the smoking gun for his family.
This was the moment everything changed for the investigation. Kaczynski's estranged brother, David, and David's wife, Linda Patrick, read the manifesto when the Post published it. And they didn't just vaguely recognize the themes.
They recognized the voice.
Exactly. The tone, the specific phrasing, the philosophical arguments, the obsession with Jacques Ellul, it all sounded chillingly familiar. It echoed letters and other writings Ted had sent them over the years from his cabin.
So David Kaczynski made the incredibly difficult decision to contact the FBI.
He did. He provided them with samples of Ted's earlier writings. And this is where a relatively obscure academic field suddenly became the key to unlocking one of the biggest criminal cases in American history, forensic linguistics.
Right, sometimes called forensic stylistics. It's fascinating.
It's critical here. The FBI had spent millions, literally millions, chasing physical clues, trying to trace metal fragments, analyze wood grain from the boxes, identify chemical residues from the explosives. All that physical forensics hit dead ends. The breakthrough came from analyzing language.
How does that actually work? Forensic linguistics. It's more than just looking for repeated words, isn't it?
Oh, much more. Forensic linguists analyze what's called an author's unique idiolect. It's like a linguistic fingerprint. Everyone has one.
So what kinds of things make up an idiolect?
It's incredibly detailed. They look at hundreds of tiny features. Things like your preferred punctuation, do you overuse commas, love semicolons, your habitual use of certain idioms or phrases, the typical complexity of your sentence structures, do you write simple sentences or lots of long, complex ones with multiple clauses, unique or consistent spelling errors, even the frequency you use passive voice versus active voice.
Wow. So it's patterns we're not even aware we're using.
Totally unaware. These patterns define your writing style as uniquely as your fingerprints define you physically.
Okay, so what were the specific linguistic quirks, the idiosyncrasies, that absolutely nailed the connection between Ted Kaczynski's known letters and the Unabomber Manifesto?
There were quite a few patterns that matched strongly, but the most famous one, the one everyone remembers, the real aha moment, involved a common idiom. Most people say, you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Right.
That's how it goes. Kaczynski consistently reversed it. In his letters, and crucially in the manifesto, he wrote, you can't eat your cake and have it too.
That's subtle,
Hmm.
but weirdly specific
Yeah.
and consistent.
Incredibly specific and consistent across documents written years apart. It's such an unusual way to phrase that particular cliche. That specific reversal, combined with other stylistic markers like his tendency to use very formal, almost archaic language, even in casual letters, his distinctive use of dashes and parentheses, it all added up. Linguists could say with extremely high statistical certainty that the same person wrote both the letters David provided and the manifesto.
So the language match was the key. The FBI finally had their man, and they knew where he lived.
Exactly. Armed with that linguistic evidence and corroborating details from David about Ted's life and timeline, they got a search warrant. On April 3rd, 1996, a team of FBI agents approached that tiny cabin in the Montana wilderness and arrested Ted Kaczynski.
And the search of the cabin must have been overwhelming.
It was everything they needed and more. The cabin wasn't just a home. It was basically a small, efficient bomb factory.
What did they find specifically? What was the crucial physical evidence?
They found bomb-making chemicals, components, tools. They found 2 fully assembled, ready-to-mail bombs. They found extensive journals written in English and Spanish, sometimes in code, meticulously documenting his activities, his thoughts, his crimes, going all the way back to 1969.
And the manifesto drafts.
Yes. Crucially, they found the original typed manuscript and handwritten drafts of industrial society and its future. The physical evidence found in the cabin perfectly corroborated the linguistic evidence from the manifesto. The case was locked tight.
But even with all that evidence, the legal process afterwards was really fraught, wasn't it? Especially around his mental state versus his desire to control his own narrative.
It was incredibly contentious. A court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Sally Johnson, conducted extensive interviews and diagnosed Kaczynski with paranoid schizophrenia. She noted delusions of persecution, particularly regarding his family and the technological system itself.
But Kaczynski himself absolutely rejected that diagnosis, right? He didn't want an insanity defense.
He fought it tooth and nail. His biggest fear wasn't prison or even the death penalty. It was that an insanity plea would completely invalidate his entire life's work, his philosophy. He didn't want his ideas dismissed as just the ramblings of a crazy person. He wanted them taken seriously as political thought, however radical.
He even tried to fire his lawyers and represent himself over this issue, and attempted suicide in jail.
He did. In January 1998, while awaiting trial, he tried to hang himself using his underwear. It was seen as a desperate attempt to avoid having the insanity defense forced on him and to maintain control over how he was perceived.
So how did it end? He didn't go to trial.
No. Ultimately, facing the overwhelming evidence, the near certainty of a conviction, and the very real possibility of the death penalty which the prosecution was seeking, and knowing the judge wasn't going to let him represent himself or dictate the defense strategy, he made a deal.
He pled guilty.
Yes, in January 1998, he pleaded guilty to 13 federal counts related to the bombings in exchange for the prosecution dropping its pursuit of the death penalty. He was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison with no possibility of parole. It allowed him to avoid execution and, in his mind perhaps, retain some control over his image by avoiding the stigma of an insanity verdict.
Okay, so Kaczynski's own reign of terror ended with his capture. But his history, especially those early years operating around Chicago from 1978 to 1980, keeps his name linked, at least speculatively, to another huge, terrifying cold case from that era, the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders.
Yeah, that connection, it's this chilling overlap of geography and timing. The Tylenol poisonings happened in the Chicago suburbs in September 1982. Kaczynski wasn't living there full-time then. He was mostly in Montana, but he had family ties. He'd been active there not long before, and his anti-system ideology was definitely solidifying around that period.
Let's just quickly recap the Tylenol tragedy itself. It was horrific, and it completely changed how we buy over-the-counter products.
It was an absolute public nightmare. It started September 29th, 1982. A 12-year-old girl, Mary Kellerman, in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, took an extra-strength Tylenol capsule for a cold and died suddenly.
And it wasn't isolated.
No. Later that same day, Adam Janus in nearby Arlington Heights died after taking Tylenol. Then, as his grieving family gathered, his brother Stanley and sister-in-law Teresa took capsules from the same bottle, and they died too.
Just unimaginable grief compounded like that. And there were more victims.
Yes. 3 more victims across the Chicago area in the following days. Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Reiner. A total of 7 people dead within days, all linked to extra-strength Tylenol.
And the cause was quickly identified as poisoning.
Immediately. Toxicology found the capsules had been tampered with. Someone had opened them up, removed the Tylenol powder, and refilled them with potassium cyanide.
Potassium cyanide, highly lethal.
Insanely lethal. Estimates were around 65 milligrams per capsule, which is something like 10,000 times the fatal dose. It was calculated, cold-blooded, and completely random murder.
The public reaction must have been sheer panic. And Johnson & Johnson, the makers of Tylenol, how did they respond?
Their response is actually considered a textbook case of responsible crisis management. They acted immediately. They issued a massive nationwide recall of 31 million bottles of Tylenol, costing them over $100 million back then. They put out urgent public warnings, offered rewards for information.
And the long-term impact was huge, wasn't it, on packaging?
Enormous. This incident directly led to the tamper-resistant packaging we see on everything now, the foil seals, the plastic bands, the glued boxes. It also pushed the industry away from capsules, which are easier to tamper with, towards solid caplets. And new federal anti-tampering laws were passed, making product tampering a serious felony.
So the investigation figured out pretty quickly that the tampering didn't happen at the factory, right? It had to be local.
Yes, that was key. When they traced the lot numbers on the victims' bottles, they found the poison bottles came from different factories and had been shipped through different distribution centers. The only common link was Chicago area retail stores.
So the theory was someone bought the bottles, took them somewhere, put the cyanide in, and then put them back on store shelves.
Exactly. Return them to shelves in different stores across the suburbs, ensuring maximum chaos and making it almost impossible to trace back to a single point of purchase or return. Pure, random terror aimed at the public and the corporation.
Okay, so that brings us back to Kaczynski. Why did the FBI, decades later, around 2010, specifically look at him again in connection with this Tylenol case?
Well, there were several compelling factors, even if circumstantial. First, that geographical and time overlap we mentioned. Kaczynski had ties to Chicago, operated there during his early bombing phase, and was certainly developing his anti-corporate, anti-system mindset around 1982.
And the nature of the crime?
Exactly. It was a form of domestic terrorism. It targeted the public. It targeted a major corporation, Johnson & Johnson, and it was carried out with cold, methodical precision. That certainly fits Kaczynski's profile in broad strokes. Plus, there was the chemical aspect, using poison.
So the FBI actually asked him for a DNA sample as part of the renewed Tylenol investigation.
They did around 2010-2011. The Tylenol case task force had been re-examining evidence since about 2007 using newer forensic techniques. Kaczynski naturally came up as a potential, if long shot, person of interest given his history.
And did he cooperate? Voluntarily give DNA?
No, typical Kaczynski. He refused. He made the FBI go through the whole legal process, threatening to get a court order to compel him to provide the sample.
What did his own lawyer think about this? Did they think he could have been involved?
His lawyer at the time, John Balaz, was quoted saying he was completely convinced Kaczynski had nothing to do with the Tylenol murders. Balaz suggested the FBI was likely just ticking boxes, trying to definitively rule out every high-profile, methodical killer known to have operated anywhere near the Midwest back then.
And Kaczynski himself, did he deny it?
He did deny it, and characteristically, he denied it in a very specific way. He reportedly issued a statement saying he had never even possessed any potassium cyanide. He focused on the specific chemical agent used.
Which is interesting, because while he was clearly a master bomb maker using various explosive chemicals,
There's absolutely no evidence linking him to potassium cyanide. His known expertise was in constructing complex explosive devices, usually delivered by mail or planted. Randomly tampering with consumer products on store shelves just doesn't fit his known methods, his MO.
And we should also remember the Tylenol case has always had another primary suspect, right?
Yes, James W. Lewis. He was actually convicted back in the 80s, not for the murders, but for sending an extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson during the crisis, demanding $1 million to stop the killing.
He served time for the extortion, but never charged with the actual poisoning.
Correct. He served over 12 years for extortion. Investigators searched his home back then, and they even got his DNA around the same time they were pursuing Kaczynski's in the 2010s. Lewis always denied carrying out the poisonings, though he admitted writing the letter. He actually died just recently, in July 2023.
So the Tylenol case remains officially unsolved.
Still an active cold case. And while Kaczynski fits a certain profile, methodical, anti-corporate killer operating in the region around that time, there's just no concrete evidence linking him to that specific crime, the specific poison, or the specific method of delivery. Getting his DNA was likely, as his lawyer suggested, about eliminating him definitively as investigators continued to pursue other leads, including Lewis.
So when we look back at the whole Unabomber investigation, the manhunt itself, it really stands out in terms of its sheer scale, duration, and cost. It often gets mentioned alongside some of the biggest manhunts in recent history.
It does. People sometimes compare it to the hunt for Osama bin Laden, maybe in terms of complexity and resources, or even the massive effort and cost over $1 billion reportedly involved in locking down Boston and tracking the marathon bombers.
But there's a key difference, isn't there? Many of those other huge hunts were very high-tech.
Exactly. Bin Laden involved global intelligence networks, signals intelligence, satellite surveillance. The Boston Marathon case relied heavily on digital forensics, CCTV footage, cell phone data. The Unabomber hunt was unique because it was fundamentally a low-tech perpetrator evading a high-tech world and a high-tech task force for decades.
He was using wood scraps and pipes, living off-grid, while they had, the full resources of the FBI.
Precisely. Kaczynski's methods were primitive in one sense, but they were incredibly organized and methodical. Most homicides, statistically, are solved pretty quickly, often within 48 hours, because there's usually a link between the victim and killer.
But serial killers, especially ones who target strangers,
they're much harder. Especially someone like Kaczynski, who often killed impersonally using the mail, creating distance, and whose weapon literally destroyed itself and much of the surrounding evidence in the explosion. It allowed him to evade capture for 17 years.
And the FBI's initial profile was way off base too, wasn't it?
Completely off. For years, they were looking for someone like a blue-collar airline mechanic, someone with hands-on technical skills but maybe not advanced education. They focused on the junkyard aspect of the bombs. They just couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that this meticulous, sophisticated engineering might be coming from a Harvard-educated PhD in mathematics who was living like a hermit. That misconception cost them years.
Yet here's the really unsettling part. Despite his conviction, despite the horrific violence, Kaczynski's ideas, his writings, they haven't disappeared. They continue to be read, discussed, even find supporters in certain corners. He's still seen as an iconic figure by some.
It's the uncomfortable truth of his legacy, that Manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, and his later books published from prison, things like Technological Slavery and Anti-Tech Revolution, they circulate widely, especially online. And serious analysts acknowledge, whether they agree with him or not, that he developed a coherent, if deeply flawed, philosophical critique of modern industrial society.
Why do you think those ideas still resonate?
Because they tap into genuine, widespread anxieties that people feel today. Worries about conformity, loss of autonomy, the pace of technological change, environmental destruction, the feeling of being controlled by vast, impersonal systems. Kaczynski offered a radical, albeit violent, diagnosis for those feelings.
So it's strange and dark that a convicted murderer, a terrorist, is sometimes discussed in the same breath as, foundational political thinkers who critiqued society.
The fact that someone like James Q. Wilson made that comparison, Kaczynski's sanity versus Rousseau or Marx, is telling. It doesn't excuse Kaczynski's actions for a second, but it signals that the questions he raised about freedom versus systemic control were seen as philosophically serious. And his ideology, because it was so fundamentally anti-system, it found adherents across the spectrum: far-left anarchists, far-right anti-modernists, radical environmentalists, nihilists. They could all find something in his critique of the technological state.
And we've even seen his writings directly influence other acts of terrorism, haven't we?
Tragically, yes. The most prominent example is Anders Behring Breivik, the Norwegian far-right terrorist who killed 77 people in 2011. Breivik heavily plagiarized Kaczynski's Manifesto in his own rambling document. He basically took Kaczynski's framework attacking the system and swapped out Kaczynski's targets like leftists with his own enemies, like cultural Marxists. It just shows how Kaczynski's template of blaming technology and societal structure for perceived ills can be adapted by extremists with very different agendas.
This brings us to that label he often gets, Neo-Luddite. It's probably worth clarifying what Luddism actually was and how Kaczynski fits, or maybe doesn't quite fit, that term.
Yeah, Luddite gets thrown around a lot today just to mean someone who dislikes new technology. But the original Luddites back in England around 1811 to 1816 were mostly skilled textile artisans.
And they weren't just anti-technology across the board, were they?
Not at all. They were protesting against specific uses of new machinery, particularly automated looms by factory owners who were using them fraudulently, in their view, to produce shoddy goods, de-skill the workforce, and drive down wages. They were fighting for fair labor practices, quality standards, and their economic survival.
So their attacks were targeted at specific machines owned by specific manufacturers engaging in these practices.
Exactly. It was targeted industrial action focused on labor exploitation. Kaczynski, on the other hand, wasn't protesting unfair labor practices. He wanted the total collapse of the entire global industrial technological system. He saw technology itself, not just its misuse, as the fundamental enemy of human freedom and dignity.
Which leads us to the great central irony of Ted Kaczynski, the self-proclaimed modern Luddite.
There are a couple of huge ironies, aren't there? First, as we discussed, this avatar of anti-technology, this brilliant mind living off-grid, was ultimately caught not by sophisticated surveillance tech or advanced forensics on bomb parts, but by the oldest technology of all, human language, by the unique way he put words together.
The science of linguistics beat the bomb maker.
Pretty much. And the second irony is just as profound. Kaczynski, the man railing against the evils of industrial technology, used incredibly complex, meticulously crafted technology, his bombs, as his weapon against the system. He applied the highest degree of technical skill, rational planning, and engineering precision, fashioning his own components, designing intricate timing mechanisms, all in service of destroying technology.
So it took the most human signature imaginable, his unique writing style, his idiolect, captured in that angry manifesto typed out in a tiny cabin to finally end one of the most technologically advanced and expensive manhunts in history.
Absolutely. It was the triumph of forensic linguistics over forensic engineering in a way. And that's a lasting lesson, I think. Kaczynski's organized, methodical, evidence-destroying crimes defeated traditional forensic approaches for years. It required his own act of self-disclosure, publishing the Manifesto, combined with the ability of linguists to read the fingerprint within his words, to finally connect the man to the crimes. The subtle patterns in his sentences turned out to be more valuable than all the shattered metal and wood fragments.
The Unabomber case really is just a stark reminder, isn't it? That even people who try to isolate themselves completely, who reject this system utterly, they still leave behind evidence. The evidence embedded in their own minds, expressed through their unique use of language.
And that fascination with his ideas, even now after his death, that tension he articulated between individual freedom and the demands of an organized technological society, it shows that the core questions he raised, however wrongly he tried to answer them, they haven't just gone away. He intended his words to ignite a revolution. Instead, they became the evidence that imprisoned him for life.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe the final thought for you, listening, is about the echoes of this case today. We saw how the crucial clue in one of history's longest and most expensive manhunts wasn't DNA, wasn't ballistics, wasn't surveillance footage. It was the unique style of a 35,000-word essay.
In our current age, where almost everything we write, texts, emails, social media posts, documents, leaves a persistent digital trail, you have to wonder, don't you, what unique signatures are present in your own language? Your go-to phrases, your common typos, your punctuation habits, those little quirks you're probably not even aware of.
Could those subtle linguistic markers, your personal idiolect, be the single thread that tells your entire story, perhaps in ways you never intended?
Kaczynski tried to erase his physical tracks, but couldn't erase his linguistic ones. In today's world, our linguistic fingerprints are more exposed, more recorded, more analyzable than he could ever have imagined back in that Montana cabin. He wanted his words to be a weapon, a call to arms. But in the end, they were just a confession, perfectly tailored for a forensic linguist to read. The digital age means the evidence of you, embedded in your words, is constantly accumulating. And ultimately, those words might speak far louder and far more revealingly than any action you ever take.